Hey everyone, welcome back. It's the first Tuesday of the month, which means it's Wildlife Vet Online live time. We're episode 12 and super excited to get back into this. We're going to introduce our panel, and we're going to introduce Dr. Rogers and also Debbie from ProVet Wildlife Services in a minute. But before we get back to that, just a message out to any of you watching either live or on replay. Post your questions in the comments or reply section of this live stream, and we'll aim to answer it live. If you're watching it on replay, we can get back to you afterwards via text, but do try and get involved as much as you can. In the meantime, post a sort of a little note just to say where in the world you're watching this from, so we can get it started. We can sort of see who's out there. So in the meantime, what I wanted to do is just do a quick recap. A couple of months ago, we ran a fantastic wildlife conservation in South Africa online conference. It's a fundraising conference that was especially trying to raise some money for 9 fantastic wildlife conservation organizations around South Africa. This has now been turned into an online course with over 700 minutes of content and lectures and panels and discussions, so much stuff in there. There's also some virtual volunteering, and a lot of the panel you're going to meet again tonight were involved in that conference. So it really is worth checking out. So here's a little summary of what that was all about. Check this out.
I love cats. Now the senior shark biologist at the ICT.
Perhaps the biggest success that I've had so far is actually to have survived so long.
It's absolutely fantastic. Go and check that out. But here is our panel. A big welcome to Beth from Bristol. Hey, Beth, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Hello, everyone.
Big welcome to Layla from Knots. Hey, how are you doing, Layla?
Hiya, nice to see you all.
Yashu from London, RVC.
Hey.
And Nicole, also from London, so representing IVSA. Hey, Nicole.
Hi, everyone.
So the panel and Dr. Rogers and Dr. Debbie are going to get involved in a minute, and we're going to start to bring them on. But I thought let's just have a quick recap to show you exactly who Dr. Rogers is. This is the first time you're joining this, as it's a new academic year. We thought we'd show you a little bit of an introduction just to get us started. So here is Dr. Rogers with a little video intro.
I'm Peter Rogers. I'm a wildlife vet working largely in the Greater Kruger Park. We have now been appointed at ProVet as you can call it the sanctuary or the rehabilitation first aid emergency treatment hospital for all the pangolins in this area. So we see them first, usually in very, very poor condition, dehydrated, stressed as anything. And it's up to us to get them back to where they're actually in a fit state to be released again. I'm called out now on a Saturday afternoon. It's 38 degrees and there's 2 cheetahs that have escaped from one reserve onto another. So we've got to get them back because there are lions on this side and the other cheetahs are going to beat them up. So we can't wait for it to cool down. It's not going to cool down much anyway. Not ideal conditions working in this heat, but we don't have any choice.
Peter, Debbie, hello, welcome back. How are you? Good evening.
Hi.
Ladies first, that's Debbie, Dr. Debbie English, my colleague.
Hey, Debbie.
Hi, everyone. How are you?
Fantastic.
She's actually very shy. How are you, Yashu?
Hi, Peter. Long time no see. How are you?
Oh, good, thank you. Nice to see
And
you.
hi, Debbie.
Your face.
Oh, and hi, Debbie. Nice to meet you.
Lovely to meet you all. I've heard a lot about you all. Good things.
Thank you so much both for joining. So Peter and Debbie, we are going to tackle the topic of wild dogs tonight. But I suppose before we get onto that, how have things been the last month since we last spoke? How's work going?
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of rhino work, obviously, on the dehorning front. And if I may, I'll sort of do a little bit of bragging that Debbie, I knew her dad when he was split school, and her dad is the very famous anti-poaching guy in Kruger. Debbie hates it when I talk about it, but her dad is a legend. And so I'm very proud to have Debbie working alongside with us. So we've been doing a lot of rhino work, but then Debbie, more so with the pangolins, if you want to say a little bit about the pangolins, Debs.
Yeah, I'm sure you guys will somewhere along the line get to the pangolin side of things, but I'm the main vet that works on these little guys when they get confiscated out of the illegal trade. And yeah, got started off here and got my first pangolin and hit the ground running and had to teach myself. Had a lot of help from people, but I don't think you really learn how to do things until you figure it out for yourself. And yeah, I think we've had 17 in the last year and a half, almost year and 10 months that I've been here, and got quite a good success rate for rehabilitating them and eventually releasing them into the wild.
Fantastic. No, thank you. So we've heard so much about you, Debbie, so I'm glad that you're managing to join this and join Peter. I know he absolutely loves these streams, so hopefully you will grow to love them too and join us as much as you can.
Shane, thanks a lot. Yeah, I've heard a lot about them. We've all been quite involved in behind the scenes work. But yeah, I'm hoping it'll do well.
Thank you. Okay, so we've obviously in the past, this is now the 12th sort of live stream we've done, 12th monthly live stream. We've covered all sorts of topics, but there's a topic that will be a module in obviously the coming months, Peter, as we've discussed, but something that a lot of the students have been very keen on hearing more about is obviously the wild dog species and something that is such I suppose, an iconic species in South Africa. So you sent us a video a little while ago, which we're going to play in a minute, and we've actually accumulated quite a lot of questions from the panel already and from some people that have sent them in. So we'd love to play the video and then maybe just dive into the topic of wild dogs and ask some questions, if that's okay with you.
Cool.
Okay, here we go.
We called out to a wild dog with a snare in the Timbavati Private Game Reserve. It's one of quite a few we've done this year. The reason being that the wild dogs, they're not limited to one place. Their territories are big. In fact, they're not really territorial. They move all over the place. So they move from one protected area to an unprotected area, and in so doing, they have to go under fences. And they usually go through warthog holes that have been dug under the fence. And snares are set to catch the warthogs, and unfortunately the wild dogs are like part of the collateral damage. They get caught in snares that are not really intended for them, and because they're such an endangered species, it's important to try and save every single one. It's really, really hot. It's 8:30 in the morning, 32 degrees. In an ideal situation, you wouldn't be working now. But this is an emergency situation, and tomorrow they might be somewhere else. So we can't say, well, tomorrow it's going to be cooler, which it is. We've got to do it today, immediately. So there are the risks, inherent risks, and the animal overheating and that, but we've got no choice but to do it. The snare's not very tight at this stage, but it'll probably tighten with time. So we have to, it's great that they've seen it now at an early stage before it digs in, and we'll do our best to get it off this morning.
Fortunately, the snare's not that deep and pretty loose, so we're going to attempt to take it off there.
Well done. Okay, Janelle just putting a catheter into the vein. That's the way we're going to give him the antidote. Actually, he's a she, eh?
Yeah, it's a female.
Okay.
Obviously, got caught in the snare and it looked like she's actually chewed her way out of it. Carried on with it.
You often see where they chew, that you find marks on the cheeks, but this one doesn't seem to have, eh? She must have got it through, but even you can see it hasn't even damaged the teeth that much, eh? Okay, good condition. Very nice condition. See the ears are moving. She's pretty light. Dosed her for 30 kilograms, she's about 30, so it's good. It's called BAM. It's a mixture of 3 drugs: butorphanol, azaparone and midatomidine. So the butorphanol is the main drug, together with the midatomidine. The azaparone is just in the middle, just a little bit, because the butorphanol causes a big spike in the blood pressure, so the azaparone brings it down. So we can reverse the butorphanol with naltrexone, and we can reverse the midatomidine with 2 drugs we use: atipamezole, which you give intramuscular, and we give yohimbine intravenously. So when the animal is awake, it's completely awake, just except for that little bit of azaparone, which really doesn't affect it. So it's absolutely perfect to get up and run away and defend itself, which is in an extensive environment like this is very, very important. It's a good time just to check the condition, external parasites, and a really, really good nick, eh? We'll check for microchips at the time. Okay, so we're just going to put a microchip under the skin and the neck. Okay, so this is the first one, the atipamezole we give intramuscular. Always give it in front of the leg because there's a big vein, a big nerve that runs down the back. Don't want to damage it. Chances of that happening are not good. Alright, and then we'll give the yohimbine. Okay. You'll see the blood is very dark because you do get a drop in the blood pressure and a slowing down of the heartbeat. Okay, so we give this pretty slowly. Oh, it's beautiful, eh?
Love that video. Thank you so much.
Hi, Peter. The first question is from Izzy, and she's asked, is it difficult to balance the remaining conservation areas between the top predators, lions, hyenas, and wild dogs? Do you face any problems with this?
Yeah, we do, because what's happened now with these conservation areas, except perhaps a place like Kruger, which is really big, it's like, 4 million acres. But a lot of these areas are smaller, and they all got 4 fences around them. So whatever's inside those areas, you've got to manage them. And, if you've got your predators, the predators, particularly the lions, have very few natural enemies. So it's very easy for them to multiply and breed, and then soon they're eating all your other animals. So with the top predators like a lion, for example, you've got to, before you wipe the mist out of your eyes, the lions have taken over your whole place and you've got no other animals left. So lions particularly, we found recently, you have to really manage them very carefully. Hyenas, the same sort of thing. The hyenas, the higher the lion population, the lower the hyena population. And the same goes for the cheetahs. The cheetahs, if you've got top predators like hyenas and lions, if there are a lot of them, the cheetahs don't do well. As far as wild dogs are concerned, they are not territorial. They tend to move, from one farm to the other, under gaps in the fences, where warthogs have got under the fences. So they're pretty much self-regulating, because nothing stops them. They move, hundreds of square kilometers. The only time, is when something happens to them is when they move out of protected areas. And then they get shot by farmers or whatever, or caught in snares. And they often get caught in snares. In a case like this one in the video, they get caught in snares when they go under fences to a neighboring area. The snares are set for like warthogs and that, because the warthogs make the initial holes. And that's how they get them. So they're part of the collateral damage. They pick up the snares that were actually meant for warthogs. But particularly the lions, one has really got to manage those populations before they get out of control. So either hormonal implants that we do, which last for anything between 18 months and 3 years, or we do hysterectomies, to try and control those populations. Because although the lions globally are highly endangered, together with the elephants, in South Africa, there's an overpopulation of them. So if you've got too many lions in a place, there's nobody actually wants them. You cannot give them away. So, now and again, the only thing you can do is to swap for new genetics. But as far as lion numbers are concerned, this country is, if anything, overpopulated with lions. So you don't want to be faced with that problem at the end of the day of having to, in the worst case scenario, destroy lions. So you've got to think ahead and make sure that your lions don't get into that position where you have to start thinking along those lines.
Thanks, Peter, for that. Next question.
Hi, Peter. My name's Nicole. It's really nice to meet you. I just had a question. It was very similar to that, but I'm from Arizona originally, and we have a pretty big coyote population. So I was just wondering, comparing the species of wild dog species that are out there in the world, I was curious about the competition from other predators, if that was what you would consider to be one of their main threats when it comes to the fact that they have become endangered, or if it's more urbanization and the loss of habitat that they have.
Yeah, look, I would say it's more a loss of habitat, because as I said just now, fences don't stop wild dogs. They stop lions. Invariably, they stop lions, hyena to a lesser degree, but wild dogs, they go everywhere. And once they get out, the surrounding communities, there's calves and there's sheep and goats, and they go for these animals. So they get slaughtered once they're out. They get chased down with dogs. They get snared, they get shot, everything. So again, it's a lot to do with habitat destruction, or loss of habitat, should I say? Yeah. And they're actually, in their way, their own worst enemies, because they don't stay in protected areas. But as soon as they come out of a protected area, that's it. They're history. In the protected areas, they're doing very, very well. It's a very, very well researched and I won't say protected species, but there's a lot of monitoring done of them. The other thing that we've seen here is like about in this area where I am, about 4 or 5 years ago, we had a rabies outbreak, and every single wild dog in this area and jackal was died. So there are natural diseases, for example, distemper and particularly rabies. But the main reason that they are endangered is because when they leave protected areas, their days are numbered.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've got a question that's coming from Liverpool, from Orla there. She wants to know, following medical intervention, is rehabilitation difficult in the species? Are other members of the pack supportive to the sick, weak individuals, or are they being left behind or rejected?
And I've mentioned this many times before with the other species as well, that the healing powers of Mother Nature are incredible. So most of the sort of medical interventions we do are snare wounds, and usually with one treatment, even just removing the snare on its own, you sort of 3/4 of the way to solving the problem. So, and you're also in nature where there's not a lot of bacteria and there's not a lot of stress, because the animal, when you wake it up, is free to go with the pack. So once you get the actual aggravating snare off and you give it antibiotics, clean it up, and in many cases we stitch it and we just leave the stitches in. I dare say that we have about 100% success rate, and they are tough. Even though these animals can keep up with a pack on 3 legs, they are really, really tough. And being a pack animal, the other animals do wait for them, and they I've seen that a lot, that they wait for them, or even bring back food to them, or even regurgitate food. So it's definitely a team effort, and they are pack animals. But in all these species, I'm almost inclined to say they come right despite the vet from their traumatic lesions. But they do very, very well, invariably.
You never give yourself enough credit. You're always saying it's all down to the animal. Very humble of you, Peter.
No, but it's true, Roger. I promise you. Yeah.
Okay, we've got one from RVC. So maybe Yashu, if you want to ask that one.
Yeah, sure. So Max is asking about the safety of using the BAM tranquilizer. So with the reversals and azaparone, is it still necessary to monitor the animal during the procedure to ensure that there are no adverse effects?
Yeah, absolutely. Any anesthetic is a risk, whether it be human beings or whatever, So especially in an animal like in that particular case, which may be dehydrated, it's very, very hot. The nice thing about this particularly BAM anesthetic is that you can reverse it, but you've got high levels of the various drugs involved in the cocktail, and that can have their side effects. With this cocktail as well, this BAM, butorphanol, azaparone, medetomidine, you can get what they call apneustic breathing, where the animal holds his breath for a while, and you think, oh, what's happened? And the breathing is slow, the heart is slow, so there are all those sort of things that are not playing in your favor. And as I've mentioned before, in all these modules, that every single wild animal that we work on, we put a catheter or a gelka into, in this case, in the wild dog's case, the cephalic vein in the front leg, the saphenous vein in the back leg in a cheetah, or the ear vein in the white or black rhino. And that is just that should you have a problem with respiration, or that the animal wakes up or wants to die, that you've got access to the animal immediately. But yeah, sure. BAM is very good. We've done hundreds of animals with it. But you just never know. And the day that you take one of these anesthetics for granted is the day that you're going to get bitten. We don't have an oxygen. We don't have an oxygen cylinder out there. We can't ventilate the animal. We can't put a tube down it and breathe through it. So you're very much working against the elements and against the anesthetic. So you just got to be on guard. And I'm very fortunate to have Janelle, my assistant, who works with me a lot, while Debbie holds the fort here. And Janelle is very, very camera shy, and so she didn't want to be on. But Janelle is absolutely amazing. She's got like a sixth sense, and she can sense when an animal is in trouble. And she saved my bacon many, many times before. So yeah, the anesthetics are always a risk, and especially in an environment where you've actually got no control of what's going on.
Thank you. Sorry, I forgot to unmute. Thank you for answering.
I was just wondering, in the hot weather that you mentioned in the video, are there any broader protocols that you have in place to help mitigate this risk, both your team and the animal that you're working with?
Okay, so the risk for the team, we tough. So we just suck it up, maybe wear a hat. But for the animal, as I said in that video, we really don't work in the hotter time of the day unless it's really necessary, like in that case. There are a couple of reasons for that, because specifically when you're working with your larger species of animals, which working with from a helicopter, you're chasing that animal. So the whole time the animal is building up this internal heat. And as soon as it goes down, when it's hot, when it goes down, the body, the animal loses its ability to regulate its body temperature. So then you can have an animal lying in the hot sun, they're literally cooking. Especially if you have a dart that doesn't work and the animal just runs and runs and runs. So when you're working with wildlife, what I always say is you try and prevent things happening, because if something happens, to cure it or to rectify it is often impossible. So because we're working with and against the elements all the time, the topography, the terrain, everything. So we try and work in the cooler times of the day. But when it's hot like this, the first thing we do is if we working like in this case a wild dog, the first thing we do when we dart it and we move it into the shade. Okay, that's the first thing. Then we monitor its rectal temperature very, very carefully. Normal for a wild dog, normal rectal temperature is about 38.5. If it goes up, it can sometimes go up to like 40. A lot of people would panic at that stage, but it really isn't panic stations. When it gets up to like 42 degrees Celsius, then it's a real problem. But if we're really concerned and the animals run a long way, in a case like that, we take these ice blocks, these freezing ice blocks, put them in between the back legs, the animal's lying on its side. We pour water over the animal. Even if it's a hot day, even water is probably the most effective temperature disperser that there is. So we prepare ourselves, we take water with us, we in the shade, we take these ice packs. And it's usually not a problem. The only problem that you can have, when you're working from the ground like this, it's fine. But the only problem is when you're working from a helicopter when it's very, very hot like this, then you can have big problems, especially if a dart doesn't work. But then, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So that's a chance you've got to take. The other thing, working in the hot weather like this, is sometimes, you dart an animal like a cheetah or a lion with a snare and it runs off and you can't find it. That animal can go down in the sun and it can literally get cooked to death. So, there are inherent risks again. So that's the whole thing again, is about working in the cooler times of the day.
Thank you so much. Yeah, definitely some very interesting considerations and some good ways of coping with it. Thank you.
Hi. So this one I actually wanted to ask to Debbie. So what type of parasites do wild dogs have to deal with, and can they pass from domestic dogs to wild dogs? And are their treatments similar?
Yeah, in the wild, wild dogs, they've got like an inherent resistance to, and the parasites are very similar to domestic dogs. Fleas and ticks and the worms, hookworms, all that sort of thing. But they are born with an inherent resistance to these. So they handle them very well. You might find the occasional tick on them. You will find they've got a worm burden, but it's only really when they're in captivity that you find that you can get with time, a gradual buildup of ticks in the area and internal parasites and fleas. In which case you have to, when they're in captivity in intensive conditions like that, you have to actually treat them regularly for all these internal and external parasites. But in the wild, free living situation, it's absolutely no problem at all. But we use the same, if we have to, we use the same stuff for ticks and fleas. It's exactly the same as they use in domestic dogs.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Oh, we've got another question from Izzy, which is UK wildcat interactions between domestic cats and wildcat population. increases the spread of fatal diseases. Is this a problem with African wild dogs and domestic populations?
So yeah, like Pete mentioned, so not necessarily breeding per se in this sense, but Pete mentioned that rabies outbreak that they had here with him, but that was before I started working with Pete. But a few years ago, probably about 2-3 years ago, they had a massive distemper outbreak in Kruger. And that's a virus that we very often see in rural dogs as well. And with a lot of these nature reserves and game reserves sharing a boundary with your communities in your rural areas, they have direct access to dogs, stray dogs, feral dogs. So they come into direct contact with them, and I think that's where a lot of this spread happens. So yes, it is a major problem with the wild dog, domestic dog populations. Because like Pete said, wild dogs look at a fence and go right through it. He's whispering here in my ear about the fences, but yeah, that is a major problem. And the same vice versa with domestic dogs going into the Kruger. Very often they get stray dogs getting into these reserves, and then the spread being the other way around.
And just a follow on from that, this is again from Izzy from Navs. Are there any current breeding programs for African wild dogs?
Again, it's a very good question. Again, African wild dogs throughout the continent of Africa are very, very endangered. But again, in South Africa, we've got a lot. If you look at KwaZulu-Natal, we reintroduced wild dogs there probably 25 years ago. They have now got so many wild dogs that wild dogs are moving. They're moving to various other reserves in the province. We've moved them to other areas, private reserves throughout South Africa. That there's like an overpopulation, a local overpopulation of wild dogs. So we're moving them as we speak. We're moving them to Mozambique, to Zimbabwe, to Malawi, to try and repopulate those areas. So basically what I'm getting at is that there's actually no need to have a breeding program for wild dogs in South Africa anyway. So because they're doing so well that we'd rather take animals from established populations that are locally overpopulated and move wild animals to other unexplored wild areas.
Thanks, Peter. That's really interesting. Yeah, thanks, Debbie.
Hi again. So I did have a question about the video, actually. In the video, you guys are checking for a microchip. And I was just wondering what the purposes of these chips were, if they were used for general population tracking, disease, infectious disease tracking, that kind of stuff and research, or if it was more of like identification as if they belonged to a certain reserve, or what the purpose of that was.
Yeah, it's always interesting, at any stage that we get a wild dog to work on, whether it's an escaped dog that you've got to take back to a reserve, or an animal with a snare like this one, we check for microchips, and if there aren't any, we put one in, because it's always interesting. From a tracking point, it doesn't mean anything, because the microchip is a passive. It's like the microchip in your dog, so it doesn't emit a signal. But it's very interesting from a monitoring point of view. If you do get one, and it costs nothing to put a microchip in. If you do get a dog with a microchip, you can trace it back and say, gee whiskers, this dog, it came from 200 kilometers away. And it's just interesting from that point of view. It's got no real significance otherwise, rather than just to actually find out how far these animals can move. So it's just a nice to have.
Great, thank you.
Ooh, and now we have one from RVC, and this is from Max again, and it is being bycatch from poacher snares a common problem for wild dog populations across all their habitat ranges?
Yeah, I think we've dealt with this a little bit earlier. The fact that they don't stay in one area, they just move, in some cases hundreds of kilometers. So it's impossible to keep them in protected areas. So snaring, there's always a snaring problem on the borders of all the reserves. And and again, the snares are particularly set for animals, for herbivores. Like for example, the warthogs that we spoke about earlier, that go through these little burrows under the fences, and the wild dogs make use of those as well. So snaring is massive, but it's not for the wild dogs alone, again per se. It's for other animals, but the wild dogs just get caught, in these snares. And then many of them that are killed. The ones that we see, luckily, they've been able to bite off their snares. Sometimes thick cables, and of course it damages their teeth, but at least they survive. But it's a big problem. It really is. It's a massive problem, a collateral damage point of view.
Thank you. And yeah, that's really unfortunate because it's like really hard to control, I imagine. But yeah, thank you for
It's
answering.
impossible.
Yeah.
We're racing through these questions. Peter and Debbie, you happy to keep going?
Yeah.
We're just basically giving you one after the other.
Oh, that's cool.
So many coming in. Okay, what have we got next? Here we go.
Hello again. Is there an average recovery time once the reversal agents have been given? And after how long would you be worried that either the drugs hadn't worked for some reason or that there was a problem with the recovery?
Okay, it depends very much on what immobilization cocktail you're using. For example, this BAM that we use here, you can wake up the animal almost entirely. Because you might have seen that the butorphanol, the azapiron, and the midatomidine. The butorphanol you can reverse, and the midatomidine you can reverse. The azapiron you can't, but the azapiron is such a low level, and it's just there to really lower the blood pressure, the spike that is caused by butorphanol being an opioid. So the butorphanol you can reverse with a drug called naltrexone, and you can give that intravenously. And then the midatomidine you can reverse with atipamezole, which one gives intramuscular, or you can use half atipamezole and another drug called yohimbine, which you can give IV. So usually in a case like this, the animal is up and about, probably within 1 to 2 minutes max. If you give it any antidote intramuscularly, it takes a while to get to the levels where it can actually wake the animal up. So that can be a good few minutes, 5, 6 minutes, perhaps, anything between 3 and 6 minutes. But the intravenous, if you can give it intravenous, stands to reason that the animal will be up and about in 2 to 3 minutes max, I would say. So if it's not, I worked on a cheetah this weekend, and I was using another drug combination because butorphanol, in this case, this BAM, I don't believe is as safe as something like midatomidine and ketamine. And I reversed the midatomidine, and the animal took a long time to get up. In fact, after half an hour, it still wasn't up, but it was lying on its chest. But that was because it was compromised. Normally with midatomidine, ketamine, with that sort of thing, they'd be up in about 5 minutes max. But because this animal was compromised, it took a lot longer. So yeah, it varies with the condition of the animal. But in a healthy animal with BAM, 2 to 3 minutes probably max, because it's intravenous. And it's almost a full reversal.
Thank you.
So I had another question, Roger. Sorry for the echo. So you mentioned the dental damage that happens with chewing off snares. Is there ever any intervention you take with the dental damage?
Yeah, there's not a hell of a lot one can do, because it's a wild animal. And to be honest, it's not that bad. These animals are teeth. I think their teeth are made of steel. But, you can't take it back to the clinic. What are you going to do? And you can't keep it in a cage, because you keep it in a cage, it chews the bars in that cage, so it does itself even more damage. But, when I say damage, it's all relative. It's not to the point that the teeth are completely broken down. They might be worn down a little bit, or the point's taken off, but they're tough. Gee, these animals are tough. And I say most snared animals, we don't see any obvious signs, because I don't think only the one animal chews on it. I think the whole pack has a go at it. So, it's perhaps, maybe I over-exaggerated a bit, but it's not really that bad.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. We
once had a leopard many years ago. The that escaped from a reserve, and I can't remember, I think it had a snare or it was hit by a car or something. So we had to, it was in a really bad way. We couldn't just stitch it up and let it go again. So we took it to a rehabilitation center. And what this leopard did is the first or second night, it chewed on these bars and it snapped its teeth off right at the base. And, it was, we kept it, and we actually had a friend of mine who's a dentist here in town. They made caps for it, and it actually worked quite well. But I don't know whether that was the right thing to do. We felt that because it was a man-made problem that we were obliged to try and get it as best as we could. We had implants put in, and I can't remember whatever, but I think after about 2 years, the implants came out, and it didn't really end well. So it's a difficult one, So again, what I said, when you're working with wildlife, you try and preempt these problems. So now I know you've got a leopard, you don't put it or a wild dog, you don't put it in an area where the bars are far apart that they can get its jaws around it. So those are things you learn as you go along. But it's all about preventative medicine.
Thank you.
Hi, one last question from me. You did already kind of touch on this, but I was just wondering more along the lines of the drug combination, if there was any other type of combination that you would use specifically to prevent overheating in an animal if you had a necessary emergency procedure that couldn't be done during a cooler time of day.
Yeah, so in a case like that one that we did now, that BAM one, I would always use BAM if an animal is in a good condition. Okay, for the main reason that you can wake it up quickly. And even more so when it's hot like that. So you want to use something that's got a quick turnaround or wake up time. So BAM would be an ideal one. But if the animal was in poor condition, I'd have to use something like metatomidine and ketamine, where you can only reverse the metatomidine. The ketamine you can't reverse. So if you had to reverse the metatomidine too early, then they get convulsions from the ketamine. So you have to wait at least 45 minutes for the ketamine to largely wear out and then reverse the metatomidine. But having said that, you've still got the residual effects of the ketamine. So the animal falls around a lot, and what happens? It gets up and it runs, and it goes and lies in the blazing sun again, and you've got to go and chase it up, and it runs again. So you want, in an ideal world, you want a completely reversible combination like BAM. There's another combination that we always used to use in the old days because we didn't have any of this newer these drug cocktails around. It's a drug called Zolitol or Tilazol. To me, that's still the best drug of the whole lot. It's a mixture of teletamine and zolazepam, so like a ketamine Valium mix. In debilitated animals, it's the best drug you can use from a safety point of view. But the problem is that it's got no antidote. The animal has got to sleep it off. So what can happen is if you leave it in the shade, the animal wakes up and then stumbles a bit and then goes and lies in the blazing hot sun again. Maybe that's a lion or something. So you do that. You can't chase it into the shade at your own, your own risk. So then you've got to put it probably into a crate, which is good. You put it into a crate in the shade, and you wait until it's fully revived, and then you go and open the gate and let it out. But I mean, that's got its own risks, especially when you're doing something like a leopard, because a leopard can turn around in its own skin and give you a very bad rash. So that's from that point of view, the Zolitol is great. But to give you an idea, I had another occasion many years ago, again before we had all these cocktails, when lay people were still allowed to dart their own animals, and these guys used Zolitol to dart a lion to move it from a camp out into the wild. So now the Zolitol, they can take hours and hours and hours to wake up, but you have to watch them, because what I omitted to mention here also is that while the animal's lying there, other wild animals can come and kill it. So you've got to have somebody watching them all the time. And at night, it's also a problem because they get very cold at night. There's no thermoregulation, all that sort of thing. So these guys, they darted this lion, they moved it from a camp out onto the reserve, and they left. This was like in the middle of the day. They left two young guys to watch the animal until it came around. Cool. And then after a while, these little guys, it's a bit like watching paint dry. So they decided, no, well, then let's go and have some lunch. And they left the lion, and they came back, I don't know, an hour later, and the lion was still sleeping. But they noticed that, around its umbilicus sort of area, there was like a little wet patch. I don't know what it was, but anyway. So I was oblivious of all of this. A few days later, they phoned and they said, no, this lion's very sick. I don't know, it's up there and it's just lying there, it doesn't want to move. Anyway, we darted it and I found a hole in the abdomen. Now, obviously something had got hold of this lion while it was sleeping. And while these guys weren't there, something like a waterbuck, something with sharp horns or a tusk of a warthog, and it actually punctured the bladder. So this animal's bladder was leaking and this urine was actually dripping out the hole. Anyway, so we went in and we had to surgically repair it. So these are all the things that can go wrong with a drug without an antidote.
Definitely, yeah, you wouldn't want any extra things to have to worry about again. So thank you.
Yeah.
So we've got one more question that's come in from Cleo, just to round up the little first part of this on wild dogs. So she asks, what would you say are your essentials to carry in your truck or box when working with wild dogs? What are the reasons behind your decisions to use the sort of cocktails, anesthetic cocktails that you do?
Okay, I think that we've mentioned the advantages of using BAM. The fact that you can wake up the animal very quickly when the rest of the pack is still around, hopefully. And then, the essentials to carry. Okay, and this, when I say talking about wild dogs, it's basically with any animals. Okay, is besides your immobilization drugs, the stuff to carry are your emergency drugs, like it be respiratory stimulants, and obviously be able to have top-up doses. There's nothing really specific for wild dogs on their own. Obviously, a mat to put them on if they go down in the sun, put them into the shade. Then, a catheter. We always put a catheter in there. That's before we do anything. We put a catheter into that cephalic vein, and of course a towel to cover the eyes. The eyes with all these animals stay open during anesthesia, so the animals we try and work with as light a dose as possible that's effective. You're not doing a heart transplant and you want the animal just sort of manageable. And of course, the lighter you can keep the animal, the safer the anesthetic. So sometimes in the case of the rhino, the animals are still a little bit aware of what's going on. So having them in a dark environment by closing the eyes with a cloth or with a hood, it just makes it quieter. The animals are less sensitive to light and to people moving around. So it's just more relaxing type of anesthesia by having the towel over the eyes, especially if the animal is still a little bit awake. And then, of course, also you've got the problem perhaps of the sun shining on the open eye and causing damage to the retina. So that's one of the things we always do. Then because the eyes stay open during anesthesia, we've got an oily ophthalmic ointment that we put into the eyes to stop the cornea drying out. It's got an antibiotic as well to prevent any infections. And then antibiotics, we carry antibiotics with us. And then also dart wound treatment. If you're using these darts and you have a lot of bleeding and that you can get abscesses formed. So we take these intramammary antibiotics. I think you've seen them. They're like syringes with a long nozzle that they're using in mastitis for cattle. It's got a long nozzle with antibiotics inside the syringe. You introduce that into the wound and you squeeze it and you massage it so that you don't get abscess formation at the dart wound itself. Bearing in mind that the needle of the dart is not sterile, the injection site is not sterile, and you're taking in maybe a bit of sand and dust into the wound. And of course, oxygen is the best culture medium for bacteria. So again, you're not going to see this animal again, so you want to make sure it doesn't have any problems. So that's that. And then, often with these snare wounds and that, you've got maggots that, in the wound. So we got maggot wound treatment and injections for that, Dectomax or ivermectin, works for COVID as well. So it's just really first aid stuff, but nothing specific, I would say, for wild dogs. And then the reasons for using butorphanol, lazapra, and midatomidine, again, the main reason is because we can wake that animal up almost immediately, as soon as we've finished. If you take the snare off and there's no damage to the skin, you can wake it up in 2 minutes. Whereas if you're using midatomidine and ketamine, you'd have to wait at least 45 minutes before waking up. With BAM, you can wake them up immediately.
Thanks so much, Peter, and thanks, Cleo, for sending in that question. So that ends part one on wild dog. We're going to show a little video now all about Debbie's speciality, I suppose, because you love working with pangolins. So we've got one of my favorite videos, which is the pangolin video involving Peter and all the fantastic work that ProVet do. We'll watch that video, then we're going to come back, and the panel have got some sort of more general questions. Feel free to keep sending in questions, anyone who's watching this live, and we'll just finish off for 10 minutes with some general topics. But first, let's check this out.
I've been involved with the wildlife industry for 35 years, and I think I've seen a pangolin in the wild maybe twice. They're very, very shy, and they're nocturnal animals, so it's a privilege in a way. It's not something people see every day. I'm Peter Rogers. I'm a wildlife vet working largely in the Greater Kruger Park, and this video is really about raising awareness of the plight of the pangolin. To poach a pangolin, once you've got a pangolin in sight, it's got no defense mechanism in which to ward a person off. You can simply just go and pick it up. And then what they do is they keep them in containers, sometimes for weeks, until they find a suitable buyer. We have now been appointed at ProVet as you can call it the sanctuary or the rehabilitation first aid emergency treatment hospital for all the pangolins in this area. So we see them first, usually in very, very poor condition, dehydrated, stressed as anything. And it's up to us to get them back to where they're actually in a fit state to be released again. This little pangolin's name is Aura. The reason she's called Aura is because she came in on a very, very windy night, and she was confiscated in a sting. She was brought to us in an extremely dehydrated and emaciated condition. This is about 4 weeks ago now, and it is so exciting and so rewarding to see how she has come this far, that she's now strong enough to look after herself and fend for herself. See, just digging for food and eating ants. I mean, they eat thousands and thousands and thousands of ants every day. It's very labor intensive to look after them, take them out walking at night, bearing in mind that they eat for 8 to 10 hours a day. So whoever walks with them has got to spend the whole night out with them. You see a success story like this, it makes everything worthwhile. And this is why we do what we do. This is not a 9-to-5 job. This is my hobby, and it's my passion. And I live my hobby. We need your help because it is labor intensive. You cannot believe it. Each pangolin needs to feed for about 8 to 10 hours a day. So it's one person who's got to be with that pangolin all the time. And when it comes in initially, it needs drips, and you've got to monitor it. And the only way to monitor its condition is to take blood. And we take blood from it on a weekly basis. Every time you take blood from it, you've got to anesthetize it. It's got to be supplemented with food every single day. It's tube fed with commercial supplements, and each time that requires an anesthetic. So the costs involved are astronomical.
Oh, Peter, always bringing a tear to the eye there, aren't you?
Well, Debbie's going to do that now.
So Debbie, just before we get onto a couple of panel questions about just sort of general topics, tell me from an emotional point of view what it's like working with a species like pangolin.
Sure. So in the beginning, a person, because I'd seen pangolins before, And to be honest, I didn't know that it was such a big problem until I started working at Provet. And the first 1 or 2, you're kind of in awe, staring at this little thing that's on the brink of death, trying to kind of day in, day out, get it to a stage where you can safely say, well, that's with pangolins, you're never safe and they're never healthy. We've seen pangolins in the rehabilitation stages that crash. But in the initial stages, it was this amazement. And now you really fight so hard to get them through each day. And you kind of, to be honest, you put your emotions aside. Obviously, when things don't go well and when you lose pangolins and when there are hiccups along the way, the emotions do get the better of you. We've had a little one, a 4.6 kilogram little one that we're busy rehabbing, and he's really not doing well in the rehabilitation setup. And he's honestly, everything that could happen to a pangolin has happened to him. I mean, the other day, he didn't do well, first of all, being moved from our hospital setup to the rehab setup. So we struggled with having to tube him and supplement him, and also trying not to disrupt him too much. Got him through those initial stages, and then he got stung by a very poisonous scorpion that kills domestic animals. We actually keep antivenom for them. So he was rushed in for that, and he pulled through. He survived, so he's back there now. But the emotional side normally hits you when you step away and take a few steps back, and you realize very often a person feeds off everyone else's energy, because myself and Peter as well, we don't often realize how privileged we are to be working with these little animals. Some people haven't seen a pangolin in their lives before. I think amazed at them, at the whole situation would sum it up quite well.
No, thank you so much. Absolutely fascinated by them. I don't know what the panel thinks, but the pangolin module you did, Peter, was just amazing, and the species is just I'm in awe of them and the work that you guys do. So thank you so much for sharing that.
So I was just wondering, how do wildlife vets communicate with each other? Because it's such a small community. Do you all just know each other? Is there sort of a forum that you all communicate through and sort of share your experiences? And do you think that's going to change in the future?
That's a brilliant question, because we always used to battle. Me being part of the older group, one of the sort of dinosaur guys. But what we've done recently, and I say recently, in about say the last 4 years, we developed a group, so there's probably, just taking a step back, there's probably I would say, I'm guessing, but probably about 60 wildlife vets throughout South Africa. When I started, there were only 6, so it was easy just to pick up the phone and ask somebody for some advice. Not that there was much around to in those days anyway. But more recent, so the email, we had an email group, okay, but that was quite slow. Now, in the last 2 years, we've got a WhatsApp group. It's called the Wild Vet WhatsApp group, and I promise you that has gone like wildfire. You can, if you're sitting with a situation, you can even have an animal on the ground, and you put a question on that group. There's going to be some guys loafing and who's not working, and he'll be able to give you some advice. But I've learned every single day, I learn something on that group. And there are so many questions on a daily basis. I don't want to exaggerate, but there must be like at least 50 different questions per day on that group, and people looking for advice and giving advice. So that WhatsApp group is absolutely amazing, because you can literally, get the answer to your question immediately, but certainly the same day. If you're going to only be doing the op the next day or later on that day, people can help you certainly. And the technology and the drugs that are evolving so fast that one's got to really keep up to date. And in the whole veterinary field, I think you guys will realize, you qualify as a general practitioner, so you're supposed to know everything about goats, ducks, chickens, turkeys, sheep, all that sort of stuff. But these days, in the old days, you could be a jack of all trades, but these days you can't. So you've got to be a specialist in your field, whether it be dogs or dogs and cats or cage birds or whatever, or sea animals or whatever it is. So even in those fields, even in the wildlife field, there's just so much changing all the time. So that WhatsApp group that we've got has revolutionized the whole way that we work.
Oh, thanks, Peter. That's absolutely crazy to think that there's just this WhatsApp group full of all the wildlife vets. That's an exclusive. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so between the two of you, Peter and Debbie, I'm sure you guys have seen just like an endless amount of snare injuries and other severe cases like that. So I kind of have a really broad question for you both, which I hope is okay. How do you assess these injuries and decide which ones are too advanced to treat? And then once an animal is in recovery, what are some of the prognostic indicators you look for to see how they're doing?
Yeah, sure. How many days have you got for us to answer
this? sorry. Like really briefly.
Like I'll start because I think with a wildlife and is a bit different to the domestic animals. I just think that firstly, what I do want to say is that the older I've got, the more of a bunny hugger I've become. And I've just seen so many things that with wildlife that we thought were, doomed cases. That have come through. That in the rhino module, that one, and we showed it a bit earlier. That rhino that got stabbed right into the thorax by an elephant. That animal was dead on his feet. But my attitude is that if you're dead for a long time. So if you can take away the animal's suffering. So now suffering would be things like pain. Pain, I think, is the big one. Pain, hunger, thirst, being able to react in its natural environment. So if you can do everything in your opinion humanly possible to alleviate that animal's pain while you evaluating it and see which way it's going. So I'm very, very loath to put an animal down for a bad wound, for example, because I've just seen them heal so quickly, and everybody says, "Oh, you're wasting your time." Obviously, if it's a broken leg, or which is these animals, obviously you can't take them into captivity. If you've got a broken leg, sure, or if you've got like a compound fracture or something like that, then they don't, then it's difficult. Then you've got to take that decision. You've got to put it down. But just as a little aside, a little while ago, and I'm telling a story against myself, I darted a female cheetah in a captive breeding center, and we've done thousands. And she's a cheetah with king cheetah cubs, and the dart actually broke her humerus. Okay, so it's happened to me twice now, but twice out of a lot of animals. So we couldn't put a pin in or plate it or anything because of the cubs. So I just put a splint on, and a rough splint. Let me tell you, it wasn't a cast even; it was just a splint. And I left it on for 3 months, and that animal is fine today. It walks barely with a limp. So one's got to be very, very careful to play God just because it's easier. I don't know. I just give the animals a benefit of the doubt as long as you can alleviate suffering. If the animal's not suffering, or even if it's suffering a little bit, it's also okay. Because the alternative is death. And as I say, if you're dead for a long time. Anyway, I'm handing over to Debs.
Yeah, I can basically second that. If I had to answer first, I would say that that's one thing that Peter's taught me. A wound really needs to be irreparable by any means for us not to want to save it. But a person looks at what determines, well, for me, in my setup and the few wildlife things I've had to deal with and had to do myself. The person looks at what is this wound going to end up with, like Peter's mentioned before, after one treatment. If you're constantly with a wild animal in your mind, if you've realized you're going to have to go back on a regular basis and try and fix and clean, and it's in a really bad spot, or it's involved not just a skin wound and it's gone into a bone or a joint, that kind of stuff. I've seen vets, not Pete, and not myself, I don't know if I would be that brave, in a hyena that actually cut and severed its trachea, and we sutured it back up in your worst possible place, with so much bacteria. It was a rotten wound, and one treatment, leaving the rest of the wound open, and that animal was walking around fine a week later. So it does go to show that think twice before you think of euthanizing an animal. I had a snared, coming back to the pangolins, I had a snared pangolin the other day, which compared to a rhino that had a hole that Pete could stick his hand into its thorax, this little pangolin had pretty much the same extent of damages. But looking at a pangolin with a snare wound that badly, with broken ribs, an exposed lung, there's no way of suturing that wound because of their physiology and the way they function. There's no way of putting that animal through that stress because pangolins don't do well under stress. So in that instance, a decision was made to euthanize that little pangolin. But it really takes a lot, I think, for us at least, and that's, like I said in the beginning, one thing I've learned from Pete. Very often I'll be standing looking at an x-ray or looking at a wound, and he'll walk past and I'll think, okay, what would Pete do? So really, that's how it works. But it really has to be very complex for us to make that decision to euthanize. There's always ways, and even if you go by trial and error, we've seen the turnaround when there's actually a will to help the animal.
Thank you. And yeah, I guess what you were saying, like right at the start, about there being a difference between general practice and wildlife, it's really interesting hearing those stories after spending a couple of weeks at like a small animal clinic, because the differences are just so jarring, and so it makes sense that your decision making is different in that situation as well. But yeah, thank you so much for answering the question.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. Thank you so much, everyone, for going through those questions. Debbie and Peter, absolutely fantastic. Just one more roundup around the panel, see if you guys have got any final comments or questions. Emily, anything you want to sort of add or close off with?
Really appreciate always being on these panels and learning from you guys. Thank you so much for your time.
Layla, anything from you?
Not particularly, but are you missing having vet students out with you? I know a lot of people who are keen to come out to South Africa.
Yeah, you must speak to Roger about that, eh?
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people have delayed that to not be able to come, but hopefully they'll be able to come out soon.
Fingers crossed, fingers crossed. Nicole, any final words from you?
Yeah, I just want to thank you guys. This is great. I've always watched the live streams when I've had the chance to. So now it's really amazing to be able to actually participate and ask my questions directly. But thank you so much for answering all the questions and for taking the time to come out here with us today.
Pleasure.
Yashu, any final words?
No, not really. Just thinking about how if you're dead for a really long time, because that is something that sticks with you. But yeah, no, nothing. Thank you so much, Debbie, for joining us and stuff, as always. Yeah, and thank you, Peter, as well.
Yashu always laughs at me.
She's always taking notes of your quotes and your words of wisdom, that's for sure.
Yashi, what's the time there where you are? Are you in Singapore?
Yeah, it's 2, but I will always stay up for these live streams because they're so interesting. So it's worth being up a little bit late.
2 o'clock. Yes.
Yeah.
She is super, super dedicated. Beth, any final words from you? Maybe lighten the mood a bit?
To say say a really big thank you. This is my first time being on one of the live streams, and it's just wonderful to be involved and to hear what you have to say. It's been fantastic. So thank you very much.
Only a pleasure. We're going to see all of you girls a lot more, I'm sure. Eh?
Definitely.
100%. And Debbie, you're now locked in. I'm afraid you're just going to have to join us whenever you can from now on.
No, it was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for staying up and working late to join us tonight. It's been a great pleasure to have you on to hear your perspective. So thank you so much.
No problem. Thanks so much.
Peter, as always, an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining us. All your words of wisdom. It's always just fantastic. Really do appreciate it, as obviously do all the panel and everyone watching. So thank you so much again. You can now relax and go and have a glass of whiskey and enjoy your evening. So thank you so much.
Pleasure, Roger. No, it's always fun, and it's so stimulating for me anyway. Especially like after a long day like today, and just to see the exuberance of youth, and the keenness, and it just inspires me so much.
Oh, that's brilliant. Well, all the words of wisdom you share always gets, transferred into so many discussions we have. And I'm sure the next blog title will probably be from Yashu, will probably be something along the lines of "Death is forever" or "Death is final" or something like that. But
dead, you're dead for a long time.
Dead, you're dead for a long time. Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to those watching. If you're watching this on replay, please keep sending in your questions, comments, thoughts, anything you want. We can always answer the questions afterwards. To Peter and Debbie, once again, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. Take care, all.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.